Most people are taught one version: Christians persecuted, Christians hunted, Christians killed by Rome. That part is real. For almost 3 centuries, roughly 64 AD to 313 AD, being Christian could get you imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Under emperors like Nero and Diocletian, Christianity was illegal. No protection, no power, no influence. Belief was dangerous. Then something changed. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. Christianity was no longer illegal. Not approved yet, but protected. That moment matters. Because for the first time, Christians didn't have to hide. They didn't have to whisper. They didn't have to fear the state. And slowly, belief moved closer to power. In 325 AD, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. This wasn't a persecution. This was organization. Church leaders gathered to decide what Christians must believe, what counted as correct doctrine, what counted as error. Truth began to be defined officially. And once truth is defined officially, someone has to enforce it. The final shift came in 380 AD. Emperor Theodosius V declared Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. At that point, Christianity didn't just have protection. It had authority. From that moment on, being Christian was no longer dangerous. Being the wrong kind of Christian was. This is where the story turns uncomfortable. Because persecution didn't end in the 4th century. It changed direction. Once Christianity had state backing, doctrine became law. Unity became political stability. Disagreement became a threat, not to God, to order. Some of the first Christians executed after this shift weren't killed by pagans. They weren't killed by emperors hostile to faith. They were killed by other Christians, not for rejecting Jesus, but for refusing to conform. Once belief became regulated, when Christianity was hunted, sincerity was enough. When Christianity was protected, obedience became necessary. And that's when faith stopped being dangerous to the world and started being dangerous to itself. After 325 AD, nothing exploded. That's important. There were no mass executions, no fires, no crusades, just decisions. The Council of Nicaea didn't introduce violence. It introduced definitions. Who Jesus was, what could be said about him, what could not. Once belief was defined, disagreement stopped being a conversation. It became an error. And errors don't stay neutral for long. Throughout the 4th century, imperial laws began to follow theology. Not suddenly, gradually. Christian emperors passed decrees banning certain teachings, removing dissenting bishops, confiscating churches from incorrect groups. The language wasn't violent. It was administrative. Unity, order, stability. Groups like the Arians felt this first. For decades, they weren't outsiders. They were bishops, teachers, majorities in some regions. Then doctrine shifted. What had been acceptable became illegal. Not because behavior changed, but because authority did. By the late 4th century, Arian churches were seized. Clergy were exiled. Worship was restricted. No mobs yet, just removal. This is how enforcement starts. Not with blood, with paperwork. Then came a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In 385 AD, a Christian bishop named Priscillian was executed in Trier. Not by pagans, not by Rome resisting Christianity, by a Christian emperor, with Christian bishops approving. Priscillian wasn't violent. He lived ascetically. He preached simplicity. He criticized church luxury. His crime wasn't immorality. It was deviation. His execution shocked some church leaders at the time. Others justified it. And that division matters, because once a Christian could be killed for theological error, a line had been crossed. Belief was no longer just protected by the state. It was enforced by it. After that, disagreement carried risk. Not spiritual risk, physical risk. This wasn't medieval brutality yet. This was still polite, still controlled, still framed as necessity. but the logic was complete. If truth can be defined, it can be defended. And if it can be defended, it can be imposed. What comes next isn't sudden. It's inevitable. After 385 AD, there was no announcement, no declaration that a new era had begun. Things just settled. The idea that a Christian could be punished by the state for holding the wrong belief was no longer unthinkable. It was precedent. In the decades that followed, late 4th and early 5th century, laws against heresy multiplied. Not executions, not yet. Bans, exiles, property seizures, loss of legal protection. Beliefs started to carry consequences outside the church walls. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire was weakening, but the structure remained. Christianity no longer depended on emperors to survive. It inherited the machinery of empire: law, bureaucracy, punishment. That inheritance mattered, because even when the Western Empire collapsed in 476 AD, the logic didn't disappear. It migrated. In the Eastern Empire, it hardened. Under Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, reigned 527-565, religious unity was no longer just preferred. It was mandatory. His legal code treated theological deviation as a crime against the state. Heresy wasn't just false belief. It was disobedience. And disobedience had penalties. Still, notice something important. This period wasn't driven by hatred. It was driven by fear. Fear of division, fear of fragmentation, fear that disagreement would unravel society. Unity wasn't presented as power. It was presented as necessity. That's how enforcement survives moral scrutiny, by framing itself as protection. By this point, the pattern was stable. Authority defines truth. Law protects that definition. Dissent becomes instability. Instability becomes punishable. No mobs needed. No fires required. Just consistency. And consistency lasts longer than cruelty. By the end of the 6th century, Christianity had something it never had before: a long memory of enforcement. Not always violent, not always public, but ready. Waiting. What happens in the medieval period doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from this: centuries of quiet agreement that belief must be managed for the good of everyone. And once that belief settles in, violence doesn't feel radical. It feels like escalation. By the time Europe reached the 11th and 12th centuries, nothing new had to be invented. The rules were already there. Truth could be defined. Error could be punished. Unity had to be protected. What changed wasn't the idea, it was the scale. When movements like the Cathars appeared in southern France in the late 1100s, they weren't stepping into a neutral system. They were stepping into centuries of precedent. They believed Christianity had become corrupted by wealth and power. They lived simply. They rejected church hierarchy. They preached moral discipline, and people listened. That was enough. In 1209, the church didn't debate them anymore. It mobilized against them. The Albigensian Crusade lasted 20 years, 1209-1229. Entire towns were destroyed, not because every individual was guilty, but because unity mattered more than distinction. When soldiers asked how to tell Cathars from Catholics, the answer was no longer symbolic. Kill them all. God will know his own. That sentence didn't come from madness. It came from consistency. The same logic that began with councils and decrees ended with swords and fire. Not because Christianity changed, but because power always finishes what structure begins. This is the part people struggle with. The violence wasn't a betrayal of the system. It was its outcome. Once belief is treated as something that must be controlled for the sake of order, force becomes a tool, not a failure. And that's why this story isn't really about the Middle Ages. It explains something that still exists: why institutions grow nervous around sincere faith, why questions are tolerated only up to a point, why obedience is safer than conviction. The early Christians killed by other Christians weren't anomalies. They were warnings, because any system built to protect truth will eventually decide who is allowed to carry it. And once that decision is made, history shows what comes next.